Benjamin Disraeli, 1st Earl of Beaconsfield, 1804 to 1881, was a British political leader and novelist who served as Prime Minister twice, 1868, then 1874-80. He gave the Conservative Party a two-pronged policy of Tory democracy and imperialism. Disraeli was of Italian and Jewish ancestry. The most significant event in Disraeli's childhood was his father's dispute with the Bevis Marks Synagogue in 1813, which led to his decision in 1817 to have his children baptized as Christians. Until 1858, Jews were barred from Parliament for religious reasons. Disraeli's political career would not have developed as it did. His first endeavors as an adult were disastrous. In 1824, he gambled recklessly on South American mining shares, and when he lost everything a year later, he was so deeply in debt that he did not recover until he was well past middle age. He had also persuaded one of his father's friends to start a daily newspaper. It was a total failure, and Disraeli was unable to pay his promised share of the capital. He then began his first novel, Vivian Grey, 1826-27, which was published anonymously and included satirical references to the publisher. When Disraeli was revealed to be the author, he was widely chastised. He suffered a nervous breakdown, and in order to recover, he embarked on a 16-month journey along the Mediterranean in 1830. These journeys would prove beneficial to his future careers. He made plenty of use of Oriental descriptions in his later novels, but the journeys also influenced his attitude in foreign relations when he became premier in the 1870s. Back in England, he quickly got into the social and literary life of the city, where his dandified attire and exotic good looks made him stand out. He was invited to fashionable parties and met many of celebrities. In 1831, Disraeli decided to enter the politics. He ran for local seats in the House of Commons as an independent radical twice in 1832 and once in 1835. But every time, he failed. Convinced of the necessity to join an established political party, he morphed his radicalism into an unusual version of Toryism, then joined the Conservative Party. Finally, he was elected as the Conservative candidate for Maidstone in Kent in 1837. His first speech in the House of Commons was a disaster. But, before long, Disraeli established himself as a commanding orator. He solidified his social standing by marrying Mary Ann Lewis, the widow of Wyndham Lewis, in 1839. Sir Robert Peel, the Conservative leader, usually supported Disraeli. But when the Conservatives won the election and Peel became Prime Minister in 1841, Disraeli was not given a cabinet position. Disraeli felt humiliated by the rejection and became increasingly resentful toward Peel and his brand of conservatism. As a response, he joined the Young England Tories, led by George Smythe, Lord Stankford. Disraeli found his moment of resurgence in 1845, when the Irish famine finally compelled Peel to repeal the Corn Laws, which imposed protective duties on foreign imported grain. Young England united against Peel not only by their own members, but also with the vast majority of country squires who formed the Conservative Party's backbone. In a series of brilliant speeches, Disraeli, as lieutenant to Lord George Bentinck, the leader of the Protectionists, Disraeli solidified the rebellion against Peel. While Disraeli and his fellow protectionists were unable to prevent the repeal of the Corn Laws because the Whigs also supported the bill, the rebels forced weakened Peel to resign in 1846 on another issue. Disraeli's election to the House of Commons as a representative for Buckinghamshire in 1847, followed by the purchase of Hughenden Manor in 1848, solidified his social and political power. The Whig government fell in 1852, and the Earl of Derby, leader of the Conservative Party, formed a short-lived minority government. Disraeli was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer, despite his protests that he knew nothing about finance. In fact, Disraeli's budget brought down the government in 1852, though he wasn't heavily blamed. Still, he would be appointed to this position again during Lord Derby's subsequent minority governments. Although Queen Victoria and Lord Derby initiated a new Conservative Reform Bill in 1867, Disraeli introduced it in the Commons. He led the fight for it with unrivaled enthusiasm and mastery of parliamentary tactics. He believed the bill should be broad and include certain safeguards, and he was adamant that it be passed by a Conservative government. However, the Liberals had a majority, and he was forced to accept their amendments, which removed nearly all the safeguards. The bill that was passed more than doubled the existing electorate and was more democratic than most conservatives had anticipated. Still, Disraeli claimed that the bill went a long way toward realizing the dream of my life and re-establishing Toryism as a national foundation. When Derby stepped down from politics in 1868, Disraeli became Prime Minister. The government was only a caretaker one, because the general election awaited only the completion of a new electoral register, and the Liberals won later that year. Disraeli ruled the party with a firm hand beginning in 1872. On several issues, he sharply distinguished conservative from liberal policy. He defended the monarchy, the House of Lords, and the Church against what he saw as the threat of radical liberal policy. He proposed a policy to consolidate the empire, with a special emphasis on India. He advocated a strong foreign policy, particularly against Russia. Disraeli's wife died of cancer in 1872, after a long illness. Her death resulted in material losses for Disraeli since her house in London and her fortune were passed down to cousins. Moreover, his health was deteriorating at the age of 68, but he remained steadfast in his political stance. When Gladstone's cabinet was defeated in 1873, Disraeli's political fortunes changed. When Gladstone resigned, Disraeli declined to assume office. He claimed that there was too much unfinished work for Parliament to be dissolved and that a minority government would only harm his party's chances. Gladstone grudgingly returned to government, but dissolved Parliament himself within a year. Disraeli had been working on party structure and election apparatus, and the Conservatives triumphed in 1874. Disraeli put together a strong government and benefited from the Queen's favor as a political conservative. In terms of social change, Disraeli was finally able to demonstrate that Tory democracy was more than just a phrase. The Artisans' and Labourers' Dwellings Improvement Act paved the way for successful slum clearance. The Public Health Act of 1875 consolidated the voluminous legislation on the topic. Equally significant were a series of progressive factory statutes, 1874, 1878, that prohibited labor exploitation, as well as two trades union acts that defined the legal status of those organizations. Disraeli's imperial and international policies were considerable as well. His first major accomplishment was the purchase of Suez Canal shares. Early 1876, Disraeli introduced legislation granting Queen Victoria the title of Empress of India. Then, Russia declared war on Turkey in 1877 and marched on Constantinople in early 1878. Britain was concerned about the safety of the road to India, but Disraeli accurately predicted that a show of might would be sufficient to bring the weary Russian soldiers to terms. The extremely pan-Slavic Treaty of Stefano, imposed by Russia on Turkey, was resubmitted to a European Congress in Berlin in 1878. Disraeli attained the Congress and gained all concessions he demanded. For a while, his bad health made it difficult for him to lead the Commons, so he accepted a peerage, assuming the titles Earl of Beaconsfield and Viscount Hughenden of Hughenden, and became leader of the House of Lords. After the Congress of Berlin in 1878, Disraeli's standing dwindled as a result of catastrophe in Afghanistan, soldiers slain in South Africa, agricultural misery, and an industrial depression. In the 1880 general election, the Conservatives were soundly defeated. Beaconsfield's health deteriorated quickly, and he died on April 19, 1881, at his house. A few days after his death, Queen Victoria came in person to place a wreath on the tomb of her favorite prime minister in the family crypt at Hughenden. During his lifetime, Disraeli's literary and political career captivated Victorian Britain, elevating him to the status of one of the most prominent people in Victorian public life. He was a key figure in the formation of the modern Conservative Party, establishing its ideas and broad appeal. Disraeli is renowned for his powerful voice in international affairs, his political clashes with Liberal Party leader William Ewart Gladstone, and his one-nation conservatism, or Tory democracy. He elevated the Conservatives to the position of party most associated with the majesty and strength of the British Empire.